Hey guys! Tonight we're drifting back in time, far, far back, to a place that somehow figured out how to stay cool under one of the hottest skies on Earth. So, dim the lights, fluff your pillow, and let's talk about how the ancient Persians air-conditioned the desert. Because yes, before electricity, before ceiling fans, before that one friend who refuses to turn off the AC even in winter, there were people quietly engineering wind and water into perfect harmony, while most of Europe was still trying to remember how to bathe. Let's begin where all good stories of ancient cleverness begin, with too much sun. Iran? Well, ancient Persia, if we're being fancy, sits in a region that is basically a love letter from the sun itself. Endless stretches of sand, cracked clay, and salt flats. Mountains in the distance that seem more decorative than helpful. Summers that didn't just get hot, they stayed hot, like a slow roast set to eternal. In many parts, the temperature could reach over 45 degrees Celsius, and the humidity was so low your shadow would dry out if you stared too long. And yet, thousands of years ago, people not only lived here, they built entire cities. Cities filled with gardens, pools, and homes that somehow stayed cool. Not less hot. Not barely tolerable. Actually cool. That's where our calm little marvel begins. The ancient Persians, it turns out, were architectural magicians of air. They mastered something that would later be called the badgir or Windcatcher, basically a tower that looked like a chimney turned upside down. Except instead of smoke going out, air came in. Imagine walking through a sun-bleached city like Yazd, somewhere around 1000 BC. The air is still shimmering. You look up, and on top of nearly every building are these tall rectangular towers, slit open on one or more sides like silent mouths waiting for a breeze. That's your ancient Persian air conditioning system, made entirely of mud brick, wood, and geometry. A badger was a wind catcher, yes, but also a wind whisperer. It didn't just grab any old air and fling it around. It worked with precision. If the wind came from a certain direction, the tower would funnel it down through vertical shafts. Inside, the air would pass over cool water in an underground pool, what they called a Qanat, and the temperature would drop dramatically. If the wind wasn't cooperating, the tower still had tricks. Warm air inside the house, being lighter, would rise up through the shaft and escape, pulling in cooler air from lower openings. It was a perfect loop, silent, self-adjusting, and eternal. And all of this without a single watt of electricity. Just air, water, and cleverness. Now, let's pause to appreciate how wild this is. While European peasants were sweating through wool tunics and pretending not to notice, Persians were lounging in passive-cooled palaces in the middle of the desert. Because of course they were. This wasn't accidental comfort. This was a national obsession with balance, what Persians called taras, meaning harmony or proportion. Their homes, their gardens, even their cooking, everything was designed to cool the body and calm the mind. The Windcatcher was just the crown jewel of an entire ecosystem of chill. But to really understand the system, we have to go underground, literally. Below those serene Persian courtyards was a labyrinth of Qanats, the hidden veins of the desert. Picture this, a series of deep vertical wells connected by sloping tunnels, stretching for miles beneath the earth. They brought cold, clean water from distant mountain aquifers down into the city. The system relied entirely on gravity, because pumps, of course, hadn't been invented yet. Each tunnel ran so gently downhill that the water moved almost imperceptibly, cool and quiet, like a whisper under the sand. When this subterranean water reached a home or garden, it didn't just fill a pool, it fed the entire cooling mechanism. The air channeled from the Badger Tower would pass over the Qanat's water or a cistern surface, losing heat instantly before entering the living space. Result: a comfortable 20 to 25 degrees Celsius indoors, while outside it felt like a frying pan auditioning for Hell's Kitchen. If you think about it, this was climate control before climate control. And in a slightly poetic twist, it was entirely sustainable. One of the most stunning examples still standing is the Dawlat Abad Garden in Yazd. It has a windcatcher nearly 34 meters tall, the tallest one ever built. You walk into that house and it feels like time slows down. The air is so gently cold, so steady, that it's hard to believe you're still in the middle of a desert. The walls are thick. The ceilings are high. The light filters in through wooden lattice windows and colored glass. Every sound is muffled, just the faint burble of water underfoot and a breeze that never seems to end. And that's the beauty of Persian design. It wasn't about showing off. It was about feeling right. You weren't supposed to notice the engineering. You were supposed to exhale and think, ah, this feels human. But here's where it gets even better. They didn't stop with just cooling the air. They cooled food. They built underground refrigerators, called yakhchāls, literally ice pits. Now, remember, this is before refrigeration, before ice factories. And yet, Persians in the middle of nowhere were storing ice in July. By using the same principles of physics and patience. A yakhchal looked like a giant beehive made of clay. Thick walls, sometimes 2 meters thick, made of a special plaster called saruj, which included sand, lime, egg whites, and even goat hair. It was waterproof and incredibly insulating. Inside, there was a deep pit where ice from winter would be stored. During the day, the conical structure reflected sunlight. At night, the dry desert air helped any remaining moisture evaporate and cool further. When combined with Qanats, the airflow around the structure kept temperatures low enough that ice could last for months. So yes, Persians could serve chilled drinks in summer, while their neighbors were probably still trying to find shade under a goat. The whole setup, badgers, Qanats, yakhchals, shaded courtyards, wasn't a set of separate inventions. It was a symphony. Each part complemented the others. The Windcatcher breathed in the sky. The Qanat whispered from below. The yakhchal held the memory of winter. And the people, sitting cross-legged on soft carpets with pomegranates and dates, existed in the calm center of it all. But because this is still a story about people, there were human quirks too. These cooling systems weren't just technical marvels. They became symbols of wealth and refinement. If you were rich, your badger had multiple openings for every possible wind direction, like a crown catching invisible currents. If you were less fortunate, well, you hoped your neighbor's tower leaked enough air into your alleyway. In royal architecture, things got particularly dramatic. The Achaemenid kings, the ones with names that sound like someone sneezed mid-sentence, built massive palaces at places like Persepolis. And while those ruins now shimmer under relentless heat, back in the day, they were designed to stay temperate. Columns funneled wind. Shaded porticos cut the glare. And the floors, often built over shallow channels of water, created what we'd now call an evaporative cooling effect. So yes, King Darius I, the great king of kings, may have ruled half the known world, but he also ruled over comfortable temperatures. By the time later dynasties like the Sassanids came around, the Persians had basically perfected their microclimate mastery. They even integrated it into temples and bathhouses. Imagine walking into a domed space where sunlight glowed through star-shaped holes, cool air drifted in from unseen vents, and everything smelled faintly of rosewater. It was less public bath and more spa built by Plato's favorite architect. And naturally, it wasn't just about comfort, it was philosophy. In Zoroastrian thought, elements like air and water were sacred. So to guide them gently, to make them serve without domination, was seen as an act of respect. You didn't fight nature, you persuaded it. There's something almost meditative in that idea, living with the climate instead of against it. Fast forward to modern times, and you'll find many of these ancient systems still quietly working. In Yazd, some windcatchers continue to ventilate homes just as they did 1,000 years ago. Tourists marvel, architects take notes, and locals shrug because to them, it's just normal. It's always been this way. Of course, modern AC units have taken over in most places, buzzing, humming, energy-hungry little boxes that can't hold a candle to a well-built badger. Ironically, while we invented machines to escape the heat, the Persians invented harmony to live with it. Let's float back for a moment to that image. A summer afternoon in ancient Yazd. The alleys are narrow, shaded by mud brick walls the color of baked apricot. The air smells faintly of dust and bread. A breeze moves through the city, not random, not chaotic, but guided, almost intentional. It slips through courtyards, past turquoise tiles, across still pools, and into homes where people nap under woven ceilings. Somewhere, a badger catches another breath of wind. It hums softly, invisible, steady. An ancient kind of quiet technology. And as the heat of the day swells above the rooftops, you realize the Persians didn't just build for the body. They built for peace. Chapter 2: The Empire of Cool, when the breeze went global. The Persian obsession with comfort didn't stay politely inside its borders. It drifted, like the wind it worshipped, out across empires, trade routes, and dynasties that wanted a taste of that sweet, desert-defying cool. Because, let's be honest, once you've seen a palace stay comfortable in 45 degrees Celsius heat using nothing but mud and geometry, you start asking questions. Especially if you're, say, a conquering general, a merchant, or just someone tired of sleeping in a clay oven of a house. The first to really take notice were the Arabs. When Islamic armies swept through Persia in the 7th century, they didn't just collect taxes and territory, they also picked up a few architectural tricks. And honestly, who could blame them? They saw these slender wind towers rising over Yazd, Kerman, and Shiraz and thought, yes, we'll be taking that, thank you. Soon, badgers began appearing across the newly formed caliphate, in cities stretching from Basra to Baghdad. Now, Baghdad in the Abbasid period was basically the glittering nerve center of the medieval world. It had libraries, astronomers, poets, philosophers, and, crucially, a climate that could cook you like a kebab by noon. So, naturally, they adapted Persian cooling methods. The wealthy elites of the city built homes with tall windcatchers, shaded courtyards, and water channels running through their floors. And if that sounds familiar, it's because the same principles later influenced the design of palaces from Cairo to Cordoba. The humble Persian breeze was going on tour. But the Abbasids didn't just copy. They upgraded. They turned Persian environmental engineering into an art of urban design. Imagine early Baghdad, concentric circles of walls, lush gardens, canals feeding in from the Tigris, and houses designed not to trap heat, but to let it escape. The city plan itself acted like one massive cooling system, a kind of pre-industrial HVAC network that worked because everyone agreed to face their windows the right way. And it's worth noting, all this wasn't for peasants. It was for scholars, nobles, and bureaucrats who could afford to be philosophically comfortable. The caliphs were patrons of everything that made life slightly more tolerable in unbearable weather, and they loved importing Persian architects. Because when you're running an empire, it's hard to look wise and serene if you're also sweating through 3 layers of silk. Let's drift a bit further west, to Egypt, where the idea really caught the wind. In medieval Cairo, the malkaf, the Egyptian version of the windcatcher, became as common as minarets. The word itself means that which grabs, and that's exactly what it did. It grabbed the northern breezes from the Nile Delta and guided them into the dense, sun-baked alleys of Cairo's neighborhoods. Some houses even had twin malkafs, one to bring in air and another to vent it out. Engineers were literally managing airflow centuries before modern fans existed. And while European cities were choking under the smell of tanneries and chamber pots, Cairo had houses that breathed. That's the difference between sanitation reform and just living somewhere that understands wind. But it wasn't just about function. Like everything else in Islamic architecture, it became an art of harmony and elegance. The Egyptians decorated their windcatchers with carved stone and latticework, turning them into miniature towers of grace. Light filtered through, air flowed, shadows danced. It was cooling as performance art. Inside, the air often passed over indoor fountains, salsables, that created a fine mist. When water evaporates, it cools the surrounding air, so even a small trickle could turn a stifling room into a place where you might actually want to read poetry instead of cursing existence. From Egypt, the idea spread further into North Africa and Al-Andalus, or Islamic Spain. There, the legacy of Persian cooling met the Mediterranean flair for symmetry and tilework. Take the Alhambra in Granada. Every courtyard is arranged around water, the reflection pools, the channels, the gentle fountains. But those aren't just aesthetic choices. They are passive cooling systems disguised as art. When breezes passed over the water, they cooled, and when they moved through colonnades and arches, they spread that coolness throughout the halls. It's the same Persian principle, refined through centuries and translated into Andalusian poetry in stone. So yes, if you've ever admired the Alhambra's serene beauty, you're also admiring a very sophisticated form of ancient air conditioning. Luxury and thermodynamics holding hands. Meanwhile, back east, Persia wasn't done innovating either. Under the Seljuks and later the Safavids, architecture in Iran reached a new level of refinement. Cities like Isfahan became laboratories of temperature control disguised as paradise gardens. The Safavid rulers in the 16th and 17th centuries, those masters of silk, tiles, and very symmetrical everything, designed their palaces with water channels running through long stone corridors. The Chehel Sotown Palace, for example, sits beside a reflecting pool that isn't just decorative. It acts like a thermal mirror. The air moving across the pool gets cooler, lighter, and drifts through the open colonnade into reception halls where ambassadors once sat sweating nervously in their wool coats. The Persians, in other words, were still hosting comfortably while the rest of the world was melting. It's also worth remembering that these cooling systems weren't only for palaces. Ordinary Persian townspeople used smaller versions. Mud brick homes had thick walls that absorbed heat by day and released it at night. Roofs were domed to prevent hot air from stagnating. And courtyards always included at least a small basin of water and some greenery. Even a humble vine over a trellis could drop the perceived temperature by several degrees. Which is what happens when a civilization has a few thousand years of practice at surviving heat. Now, over in Mughal India, the Persian breeze found another home. The Mughals, descendants of Central Asian conquerors, were deeply inspired by Persian culture. They adopted its language, art, and, of course, its architectural philosophy. That's why when you visit the Red Fort in Delhi or the Shalimar Gardens in Lahore, you'll find familiar patterns, water channels, shaded pavilions, and secret systems that kept royal chambers cooler than the burning plains outside. The Mughals brought in Persian engineers to design Takhti Breeze, literally, throne of the wind, rooms positioned to catch every whisper of moving air. They built marble fountains not just for beauty, but for evaporation. And they lined palaces with jolly screens, stone lattices carved so delicately they could filter sunlight and guide breezes at the same time. Even the Taj Mahal, though famous as a tomb, functions as a marvel of thermal design. The symmetry of the gardens, the reflecting pool, the thick marble, all of it keeps the air cool and the structure temperate. It's love, grief, and climate science rolled into one very photogenic package. And yet, the irony is, as these ideas spread, the world started forgetting where they came from. By the time Europeans began exploring the Middle East and India in the 17th and 18th centuries, they were impressed, but also strangely dismissive. To them, it was Oriental charm, not engineering. British colonial officers, dripping with sweat inside stone mansions, often remarked on how native buildings stayed cooler, but somehow didn't think to copy the design. Because, of course, why listen to people who'd been handling the climate just fine for 3 millennia? Instead, they built European-style houses that trapped heat beautifully, then wondered why their pith helmets didn't help. Let's drift back to Persia for a moment, where the 19th century brought new challenges. Colonial trade, industrialization, and urban sprawl began disrupting the old systems. Qanats were neglected or collapsed. Windcatchers were replaced with flat roofs and imported bricks. And the gentle partnership between air and architecture began to fray. It's oddly poetic. Really, human progress often means forgetting how to be comfortable without machines. Still, in rural Iran, the old ways persisted. Farmers continued to channel Qanats into their homes. Families built their kitchens in the coolest corners. Even today, in desert villages like Maybad or Nain, you can find windcatchers standing tall against the skyline, still drawing invisible rivers of air. They hum quietly, ignored by modern traffic, doing what they've done for centuries, making life bearable with nothing but wind and wisdom. In the 20th century, architects rediscovered these systems under a new, shinier term, passive cooling. Suddenly, what Persians had been doing since 1000 BCE was rebranded as an eco-friendly innovation. There were papers, conferences, and design awards, because apparently ideas only count once they've been rediscovered with modern jargon. But you can't really patent history. The Persians had already solved it, elegantly, thousands of years ago. What makes the story of Persian cooling so strangely soothing isn't just the ingenuity, it's the humility. Everything about the design assumes you can't win against nature. You can only negotiate. The Windcatcher doesn't force air where it doesn't want to go. It invites it. The Qanat doesn't fight the desert. It slides beneath it. The Yakhchal doesn't defy the sun. It simply hides from it better than you ever could. There's wisdom in that, something calm, enduring, and a little melancholy. A civilization that learned not to dominate, but to coexist. Even now, in modern Iranian cities, some architects are returning to those roots. They're designing solar-integrated wind towers, hybrid Qanat systems, and climate-sensitive urban plans. Because, apparently, the future might look a lot like the past. When fossil fuels fade and temperatures rise, we might all be calling our architects and saying, "Can we get one of those ancient Persian things that makes the house breezy without killing the planet?" And somewhere, in the quiet ruins of Yazd, a 1,000-year-old tower might just be smiling into the wind. Chapter 3. The Cool Kingdoms, Palaces, Power, and the Politics of Temperature. Royal comfort, it turns out, was not merely a luxury in Persia. It was a political strategy. You could measure a ruler's legitimacy not by their armies, not by their coinage, but by how pleasantly cool their palace felt in midsummer. Because nothing says divine favor like being able to nap under silk sheets while the rest of your city is roasting alive. Let's drift into the court of Darius the Great, around the 5th century BC. The Achaemenid Empire is vast, a patchwork of deserts, mountains, and coastal plains stretching from the Aegean to the industry managing all that is exhausting. So Darius, who was never one to do anything halfway, commissioned Persepolis, the most gloriously unnecessary complex in ancient history. To the untrained eye, it looks like a pile of ruined columns scattered across a dusty plateau. To the Persians, it was paradise architecture made manifest. And crucially, it was engineered for calm. Persepolis wasn't just about showing off. It was about showing control, over people, over nature, over heat itself. The site was chosen carefully, elevated, open to prevailing winds, and near enough to mountain springs to feed an entire network of cisterns and basins. The city was, in effect, air-conditioned by geography. Each great hall was built with stone floors that absorbed night coolness and released it slowly through the day. The walls were thick enough to make echoes feel heavy. Columns created vast shaded corridors where air could circulate freely. At certain times of day, breezes would drift through the open halls, carrying faint traces of water from hidden channels that ran beneath the marble floors. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't flashy. It was just comfortable. And that was the point. A king whose court stayed temperate while the world outside shimmered under the sun looked like a man blessed by Ahura Mazda himself. Later rulers caught on quickly. Comfort, like conquest, became a royal prerogative. When the Parthians took over, they inherited not just the throne but also the technology of tranquility. Their palaces at Hecatompylos and Ctesiphon followed the same principles. Domed roofs trapped rising heat. Water flowed quietly through channels known as sarband. Every architectural curve had a purpose. Even the elaborate stucco patterns on the walls subtly broke up air currents, creating gentle turbulence that helped keep the rooms ventilated. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to be an ancient Persian nobleman in 40 degrees Celsius heat, imagine sitting in a shaded marble hall, sipping watered wine, and pretending to listen to a poet while your personal climate system hums softly around you. That was power, not loud, not theatrical, just perpetually cool. By the time the Sassanids took the stage around the 3rd century CE, royal cooling had evolved into something close to art therapy. Their palaces, like the legendary Takhtasra at Ctesiphon, were masterpieces of both scale and serenity. The Great Iwan Arch, soaring 37 meters high, wasn't merely architectural vanity. It was also a ventilation shaft. Warm air rose through the enormous chamber and escaped above the arch's curve, pulling cooler air inward from the shaded gardens behind. The effect was like a silent, invisible wind machine powered entirely by physics and royal entitlement. And because the Sassanids adored grand ceremony, they paired this environmental engineering with an equally deliberate performance of leisure. Court ritual required calm faces, unruffled garments, and voices that never rose above a murmur, all of which were much easier to achieve when your palace was perfectly ventilated. In Persian political culture, stillness meant strength. To show agitation was to reveal weakness. And so, climate comfort became a subtle weapon of power. A king who could host foreign envoys in an oasis of chilled serenity while their own emissaries sweated through linen tunics instantly had the upper hand. It's difficult to negotiate when you're overheating. The Persians understood this intuitively. They didn't need to shout. They just needed to turn up the temperature. For you, not for them. Even their gardens carried this logic. The Persian Shaharbagh, the four-part garden divided by water channels, wasn't only symbolic of paradise. It was a climate system disguised as theology. Each quarter represented the world's balance of elements: earth, air, fire, and water, arranged for maximum airflow and evaporation. Walk along the stone pathways of one of these gardens and you'd feel the temperature drop, degree by gentle degree. The sound of water wasn't just for ambience, it was a cooling mechanism. Evaporation from the channels created a microclimate, lowering the air temperature just enough to make the space feel otherworldly. So when Persian poets described these gardens as a mirror of heaven, they weren't exaggerating. It did feel divine, especially if you were used to the scorching dust of the plateau beyond the palace walls. The royals of later dynasties took the concept even further, because if comfort equals prestige, more comfort means more prestige. By the medieval period, palatial cooling had become almost competitive. Every Shah wanted the most efficient breeze, the clearest water, the deepest shade. The Safavid Shah Abbas I, ruling in the 17th century, basically turned climate control into a state religion. His capital, Isfahan, was laid out with geometry so precise it bordered on obsessive. Avenue orientations, garden placements, even mosque courtyards were calculated to capture the northwesterly winds that swept in from the Zagros Mountains. At the center of it all stood his palaces, Ali Kapı and Chehel Sotown, each an elaborate exercise in how to impress ambassadors without breaking a sweat. Ali Kapı's music room is particularly poetic. Its walls are carved with delicate acoustic niches that also serve as air diffusers. They soften both sound and temperature, turning the entire chamber into a kind of passive cooling concert hall. You could perform, talk, or scheme, and the air would quietly collaborate with your dignity. Meanwhile, Chehel Sotown, the 40 columns, took reflective cooling to almost comical heights. The palace sits at the edge of a long pool, which doubles the visual count of its 20 slender columns through perfect reflection. But that pool isn't just for show. It's part of a temperature regulation loop. The breeze moving across its surface picks up moisture, carries it into the open pavilion, and drops the temperature by several degrees. The Shah could sit in his fresco-covered hall, surrounded by diplomats from Venice or Mughal India, and exude an almost supernatural calm. He looked blessed. They looked sticky. Mission accomplished. It's worth pausing to notice how deeply psychological all this was. For the Persians, heat and chaos were linked, both signs of disorder. Coolness, meanwhile, meant restraint, order, and divine alignment. So architecture wasn't just environmental, it was moral. To live in balance with air and water was to live righteously. To ignore them, to build foolishly, to overheat, was to invite ruin. Even language reflected it. Words like sardar, cool-headed, were compliments. Being hot was not. Somewhere between theology and thermodynamics, the Persians discovered the calm aesthetic of power. Royal architects, of course, were under constant pressure to innovate, quietly. They weren't supposed to flaunt their genius, but their designs had to make life tolerable for people wearing 30 layers of brocade. So they developed hybrid techniques, hidden vents behind carved plaster, double domes with air gaps for insulation, underground corridors known as binamaha that linked rooms to the Qanat system below. Guests never saw the machinery, because there wasn't any. Just pure design, invisible and eternal. If an ambassador ever noticed that the room was perfectly cool despite blazing sunlight outside, the Shah could smile faintly and say, "It is simply the will of heaven." Which, translated loosely, meant, "My engineers are better than yours." Cooling systems even affected royal routines. Court ceremonies were scheduled around the behavior of air. Public audiences, or diwan, were held in shaded iwans facing the wind. Private banquets happened in underground chambers during the hottest months, where air moved through Qanat-cooled vents. Even meals were synchronized to temperature cycles. Morning dishes were warm and spiced. Evening feasts emphasized cold yogurt, mint, and cucumbers, ingredients chosen as much for their symbolic coolness as for flavor. You could say Persian royalty dined on thermodynamics. The most extravagant of these microclimates were the badgir complexes of Yazd and Kerman, where entire palace wings were designed around airflow choreography. Some towers had adjustable wooden panels to fine-tune the direction and volume of the wind. Others included internal shafts leading down to subterranean pools, so that air would rush over the water before entering the royal quarters. It was like having a natural AC unit with settings for desert afternoon and imperial nap. Servants were trained to monitor the flow, adjusting doors, screens, and curtains to maintain the perfect level of breeze. This was quite literally climate as court protocol. Over time, the symbolism of coolness became inseparable from legitimacy. When a ruler fell from grace, poets would describe his palace as hot, the air stale, the fountains dry, the wind refusing to enter. Temperature became metaphor. To lose divine favor was to lose the breeze. Conversely, a just and wise ruler was spring-like, his halls fragrant and temperate. Every description of good governance was also a weather report. Of course, this serene perfection had its ironies. The same palaces that embodied balance often required enormous labor to maintain. Qanats collapsed, cisterns needed cleaning, plaster cracked under the sun. The working class, builders, water carriers, maintenance crews, lived in the same climate without the benefit of all that geometry. So while the Shahs floated through perfumed breezes, the people keeping the system alive were quietly baking outside. Even the most elegant paradise has a maintenance department. Yet, despite that imbalance, there's something strangely humane about Persian royal architecture. Unlike the monumental chill of European castles or the humid pomp of tropical courts, Persian palaces were built for coexistence. They embraced fragility. Every wall, every pool, every tower was a negotiation between human comfort and natural indifference. And that negotiation produced beauty, not the kind that dazzles, but the kind that endures. Centuries later, when travelers from the West visited Persia, they often failed to understand what they were seeing. They admired the tiles, the domes, the calligraphy, but missed the real marvel, that the air itself was part of the design. French and British envoys in the 19th century wrote detailed reports on Persian palaces but treated the Windcatchers as curious ornaments. They didn't realize those ornaments were what allowed the Shah to host them without breaking a sweat. You can almost imagine the Persian courtiers smirking politely behind their fans. And so, from Darius's stone terraces to Shah Abbas's mirrored halls, royal comfort remained the empire's quiet signature. The Persians may have fought wars, built roads, minted coins, but their greatest conquest was always the same: heat. They tamed it without violence, subdued it without engines, and turned it into something almost spiritual. A constant, invisible symbol of grace under pressure. Even now, in the ruins of Persepolis or the half-silent courtyards of Isfahan, you can feel it. The ghost of cool air, moving through time, still loyal to the architecture that shaped it. Chapter 4. The Windcatcher's Whisper, Towers of Air and Quiet Pride. By now, we've drifted through the deep vaults of Persian ingenuity, from the underground reservoirs to the slow breathing of Qanats and the calculated grace of their ventilation. But the real crown jewel of Persian cooling technology, the one that truly looks like something a sleep-deprived architect hallucinated after staring at the desert too long, was the badgir or windcatcher. And if you've ever seen one, you know exactly what I mean. A badgir looks like a tower that forgot what its job was supposed to be. It doesn't reach the heavens like a minaret, nor does it look defensive like a fortress. Instead, it stands there with openings carved near the top, sometimes in every direction, as if it's trying to listen to all four winds at once. Which, technically it is. These things weren't just decorative add-ons. They were ancient air conditioners, centuries before anyone could plug something into a wall. The concept was deceptively simple. Harness the natural power of the wind to ventilate, cool, and sometimes even dehumidify a home. But the execution? Pure Persian brilliance, refined through centuries of architectural patience and a very healthy dose of, let's make this look dramatic. Picture a sprawling courtyard house in Yazd, walls the color of honey, sunlight pressing against them like molten gold. Rising from one corner is the badgir, tall and calm, its multiple slits like quiet eyes gazing across the desert horizon. Inside, the tower splits the incoming breeze and channels it down vertical shafts, pushing the cool air toward the rooms or over a pool of water in the basement. The result? A subtle, continuous airflow that drops the temperature by several degrees, without a single moving part. No fans, no electricity. Just geometry and wind. The genius, of course, was in the details. Badgers could be single-directional or multi-directional, depending on the dominant wind patterns in a region. The multi-directional ones were especially theatrical. 4 or even 8-sided towers, each side open to a potential breeze, like a building that couldn't decide which direction to face. Engineers, well, architects, though engineer is probably more accurate, studied the local topography and winds like modern meteorologists. Except their forecasts didn't come from a satellite but from experience and intuition passed down through generations. And in typical Persian fashion, form followed function, but only after stopping for a brief moment to admire its own reflection. Badgers became symbols of refinement. Their presence wasn't just practical, it was a quiet statement of taste and status. The wealthier the household, the taller and more ornate the Windcatcher. Some were adorned with decorative brickwork, stucco, or even tile, not because the wind needed it, but because humans can't resist the urge to decorate their inventions. Of course, not every badger worked perfectly. There were times when the wind didn't blow, or when dust storms decided to get involved. And let's be honest, having your air conditioner fill your living room with desert grit isn't ideal. But the Persians, ever adaptable, found ways to mitigate that too. Some badgers were designed with clever filters or water traps at the base of the shafts to catch dust before it entered the house. Others were paired with those subterranean water basins we mentioned earlier, the anbars, to humidify and purify the air before it wafted into the upper rooms. Now, let's drift for a moment into the city of Yazd itself, that open-air museum of desert architecture. The skyline there isn't marked by skyscrapers or neon, but by badgers. Dozens of them. Some lean slightly after centuries of heat, some still proudly catching the same winds their builders once studied. From above, the city looks like it's covered in a forest of sandstone chimneys, all whispering to one another about which way the wind's blowing today. There's something deeply poetic about that. These towers were built to serve, to cool, to protect. But over time, they became symbols of patience, of humans learning to live with nature rather than against it. And if you think this was all just a domestic convenience, think again. The same principles that cooled houses also applied to public structures: mosques, schools, caravanserais. Traveling merchants, weary from days on the Silk Road, could step into a courtyard cooled by the gentle hum of the wind, and for a moment, forget the furnace of the world outside. The air would shift softly, carrying the scent of earth and water. Maybe a faint trace of baked bread from a nearby kitchen. Not bad for 900 BC, give or take. But as with all things Persian, there's always that blend of practicality and poetry. The badger wasn't just an engineering feat, it was a metaphor for harmony. It symbolized balance between the seen and unseen forces of the world. The wind, invisible yet powerful, guided through a structure crafted by human hands. A partnership, not a conquest. And of course, because humans can't resist competition, entire towns eventually started one-upping each other with bigger and grander windcatchers. The tallest recorded one stands in Yazd, rising over 33 meters high, roughly the height of an 11-story building. It sits atop the Dawlatabad Garden, an estate built in the 18th century for a Persian ruler who clearly wanted everyone to know he had the best air circulation in town. Imagine that, a palace cooled not by privilege or power, but by physics. Now, to the untrained eye, it all seems quaint, an ancient curiosity. But in a world slowly remembering how to build sustainably, the badger suddenly doesn't look old-fashioned at all. It looks prophetic. Architects today still study them, trying to replicate their efficiency without the energy cost. Because, really, if the Persians could air-condition their homes with nothing but wind, clay, and geometry, maybe we're the ones who overcomplicated things. Let's float, then, to the quieter edges of this legacy, where these ancient technologies met daily life. Because while kings and scholars might have enjoyed their breezy halls, the real story lies with the people who lived, slept, and grew old beneath those whispering towers. The mothers who kept their bread dough cool in shaded alcoves. The children who climbed up toward the badger's mouth, peering into the desert beyond. The old men who sat by the pool at night, listening to the low hum of air moving through brick, the sound of survival turned into comfort. Let's drift there next, to the ordinary Persians who lived in extraordinary houses, cooled by invisible hands. Chapter 4. The Windcatcher's Whisper, Towers of Air and Quiet Pride. By now, we've drifted through the deep vaults of Persian ingenuity, from the underground reservoirs to the slow breathing of Qanats and the calculated grace of their ventilation. But the real crown jewel of Persian cooling technology, the one that truly looks like something a sleep-deprived architect hallucinated after staring at the desert too long, was the badger or windcatcher. And if you've ever seen one, you know exactly what I mean. A badger looks like a tower that forgot what its job was supposed to be. It doesn't reach the heavens like a minaret, nor does it look defensive like a fortress. Instead, it stands there with openings carved near the top, sometimes in every direction, as if it's trying to listen to all four winds at once. Which, technically it is. These things weren't just decorative add-ons. They were ancient air conditioners, centuries before anyone could plug something into a wall. The concept was deceptively simple. Harness the natural power of the wind to ventilate, cool, and sometimes even dehumidify a home. But the execution? Pure Persian brilliance, refined through centuries of architectural patience and a very healthy dose of, let's make this look dramatic. Picture a sprawling courtyard house in Yazd, walls the color of honey, sunlight pressing against them like molten gold. Rising from one corner is the badger, tall and calm, its multiple slits like quiet eyes gazing across the desert horizon. Inside, the tower splits the incoming breeze and channels it down vertical shafts, pushing the cool air toward the rooms or over a pool of water in the basement. The result? A subtle, continuous airflow that drops the temperature by several degrees, without a single moving part. No fans, no electricity. Just geometry and wind. The genius, of course, was in the details. Badgers could be single-directional or multi-directional, depending on the dominant wind patterns in a region. The multi-directional ones were especially theatrical. 4 or even 8-sided towers, each side open to a potential breeze, like a building that couldn't decide which direction to face. Engineers, well, architects, though engineer is probably more accurate, studied the local topography and winds like modern meteorologists. Except their forecasts didn't come from a satellite but from experience and intuition passed down through generations. And in typical Persian fashion, form followed function, but only after stopping for a brief moment to admire its own reflection. Badgers became symbols of refinement. Their presence wasn't just practical, it was a quiet statement of taste and status. The wealthier the household, the taller and more ornate the windcatcher. Some were adorned with decorative brickwork, stucco, or even tile, not because the wind needed it, but because humans can't resist the urge to decorate their inventions. Of course, not every badger worked perfectly. There were times when the wind didn't blow, or when dust storms decided to get involved. And let's be honest, having your air conditioner fill your living room with desert grit isn't ideal. But the Persians, ever adaptable, found ways to mitigate that too. Some badgers were designed with clever filters or water traps at the base of the shafts to catch dust before it entered the house. Others were paired with those subterranean water basins we mentioned earlier, the anbars, to humidify and purify the air before it wafted into the upper rooms. Now, let's drift for a moment into the city of Yazd itself, that open-air museum of desert architecture. The skyline there isn't marked by skyscrapers or neon, but by badgers. Dozens of them. Some lean slightly after centuries of heat, some still proudly catching the same winds their builders once studied. From above, the city looks like it's covered in a forest of sandstone chimneys, all whispering to one another about which way the wind's blowing today. There's something deeply poetic about that. These towers were built to serve, to cool, to protect. But over time, they became symbols of patience, of humans learning to live with nature rather than against it. And if you think this was all just a domestic convenience, think again. The same principles that cooled houses also applied to public structures: mosques, schools, caravanserais. Traveling merchants, weary from days on the Silk Road, could step into a courtyard cooled by the gentle hum of the wind, and for a moment, forget the furnace of the world outside. The air would shift softly, carrying the scent of earth and water. Maybe a faint trace of baked bread from a nearby kitchen. Not bad for 900 BCE, give or take. But as with all things Persian, there's always that blend of practicality and poetry. The badger wasn't just an engineering feat, it was a metaphor for harmony. It symbolized balance between the seen and unseen forces of the world. The wind, invisible yet powerful, guided through a structure crafted by human hands. A partnership, not a conquest. And of course, because humans can't resist competition, entire towns eventually started one-upping each other with bigger and grander windcatchers. The tallest recorded one stands in Yazd, rising over 33 meters high, roughly the height of an 11-story building. It sits atop the Dawlatabad Garden, an estate built in the 18th century for a Persian ruler who clearly wanted everyone to know he had the best air circulation in town. Imagine that, a palace cooled not by privilege or power, but by physics. Now, to the untrained eye, it all seems quaint, an ancient curiosity. But in a world slowly remembering how to build sustainably, the badger suddenly doesn't look old-fashioned at all. It looks prophetic. Architects today still study them, trying to replicate their efficiency without the energy cost. Because, really, if the Persians could air-condition their homes with nothing but wind, clay, and geometry, maybe we're the ones who overcomplicated things. Let's float, then, to the quieter edges of this legacy, where these ancient technologies met daily life. Because while kings and scholars might have enjoyed their breezy halls, the real story lies with the people who lived, slept, and grew old beneath those whispering towers. The mothers who kept their bread dough cool in shaded alcoves. The children who climbed up toward the badger's mouth, peering into the desert beyond. The old men who sat by the pool at night, listening to the low hum of air moving through brick, the sound of survival turned into comfort. Let's drift there next, to the ordinary Persians who lived in extraordinary houses, cooled by invisible hands. Chapter 5. Life beneath the wind, cool courtyards, and the quiet art of surviving summer. Let's drift down from the rooftops now, past the silent windcatchers and the soft golden walls, into the heart of the Persian home, the courtyard. If the badger was the lungs, this was the heart. Shaded, centered, calm, and always the coolest place to be. A typical Persian courtyard wasn't designed for showing off. It wasn't about symmetry or ornamentation for its own sake, though of course, Persians couldn't help themselves, and it ended up being beautiful anyway. The courtyard was about survival, balance, and rhythm. The desert outside was vast, harsh, and loud. The courtyard was its opposite, an inward, private world, where air, light, and water all learned to move slowly. Step inside, and you'd find yourself in a different climate altogether. The walls around you, thick as a castle's, held the coolness from the night before. The air drifted lazily across the pool. Yes, there was almost always a pool, and the scent of damp clay and blooming jasmine would hang in the stillness. The badger above would sigh quietly, pulling air down through its channels, letting it glide across the courtyard like a ghostly servant carrying invisible trays of freshness. And this wasn't just luck or happy coincidence. Every single part of that house was a calculated act of resistance against the sun. Let's start with the walls. They were made of mud brick, that humble mix of clay, straw, and water that, when dried under the same sun it was built to defy, became one of the most efficient insulators ever invented. A mud brick wall could be more than half a meter thick, enough to keep heat out during the day and release warmth slowly through the night. Modern architects talk about thermal mass as if it's a new concept. Persians were living in it 3,000 years ago. Then there was orientation. Persian houses weren't just plopped randomly on a plot of land, they were aligned with surgical precision. Builders paid attention to wind direction, sun path, and even the surrounding landscape. The north-facing rooms, known as Zemestineschen, were for winter, catching the low sun's warmth. The south-facing rooms, Tebestineschen, were for summer, sheltered from direct light and constantly kissed by air drawn down from the badgir. So a Persian home wasn't static, it was a living organism that changed its rhythm with the seasons. Families would move from one wing to another, carrying their rugs, cushions, and copper trays of tea as naturally as migrating birds. And oh, the pool, the house. Always there, right in the center, a mirror of the sky. Sometimes octagonal, sometimes rectangular, sometimes just a simple basin of blue tiles, but always positioned perfectly under the open sky. It wasn't just for decoration, it was science disguised as serenity. The water cooled the air through evaporation, amplified the breeze, and reflected light into the shaded rooms. It was the most peaceful form of climate control ever devised. At night, the courtyard turned into the family's favorite bedroom. In the heart of summer, when even the thickest walls began to sigh under the weight of heat, everyone moved outside. Cushions were spread out, mosquito nets hung, and the courtyard became a sea of quiet breathing under the stars. There's something hauntingly beautiful about that image. A dozen people asleep under the open sky, their lives cooled by the same wind that had traveled across mountains, deserts, and orchards before finding them. Of course, this wasn't some romantic escape from hardship. It was necessity. The Persian summer was brutal, and life adapted. But that adaptation birthed a kind of poetry, the poetry of restraint, of using what the earth already offered. Shade, water, air, silence. And while these homes look simple from the outside, blank walls, minimal decoration, often with just a small doorway facing the street, that was deliberate too. Persian cities were built for privacy and climate, not curb appeal. Streets were narrow, twisting like dried riverbeds, to keep them shaded most of the day. Houses turned inward, ignoring the world beyond their high walls. To walk through Yazd or Kashan is to move through a city of secrets, quiet exteriors concealing private paradises. Inside, though, the beauty unfolded. Carved wooden doors opened into tiled hallways, courtyards with fountains, painted ceilings, and rooms cooled by the hush of circulating air. Everything worked together: architecture, physics, and the unspoken understanding that comfort didn't come from fighting nature, but from working gently with it. Even the sound design, if we can call it that, was intentional. Water dripping from a fountain, the rustle of leaves from the courtyard trees, the muted hum of wind through the badgir. Together, they created a kind of slow ambient soundtrack to life. It's not hard to imagine how this constant softness might have shaped Persian culture. The literature, the poetry, even the way people spoke. You live in a space like that long enough, you start to think in verse. But these houses weren't just cooling devices. They were social organisms. The courtyard wasn't just for temperature control, it was for living. It was where weddings were held, children played, food was shared, and gossip circulated more efficiently than air. Every family memory echoed off those mud brick walls. The environment shaped not just how Persians built, but how they lived together, slowly, inwardly, and always aware of balance. And the same principles applied to caravanserais, those roadside inns that dotted the Silk Road, offering travelers a brief reprieve from the furnace outside. Each one was basically a giant courtyard house, scaled up for dozens of people and their animals. The layout was the same: thick walls, central pool, small rooms opening inward. Horses and camels got their own shaded quarters, and people slept nearby, lulled by the same cool drafts and murmuring fountains. Even in the middle of nowhere, Persian architecture knew how to create a sense of home. So when we think about ancient air conditioning, it wasn't just about technology. It was about philosophy, a worldview that saw comfort not as dominance over nature, but as coexistence with it. Persian builders didn't try to banish heat. They redirected it, softened it, made peace with it. And maybe that's the real legacy here, not just the engineering, but the attitude. The quiet confidence that says, yes, the world outside is brutal, but if we design wisely and live gently, we can carve out our own oasis. Let's stay in that oasis for a while, because from these homes and courtyards came not only comfort, but also the architecture of empire. When kings and shahs built their palaces, they didn't abandon the principles of the common home, they magnified them. And that's where we'll drift next, into the royal gardens and palaces of Persia, where the science of cool air met the politics of luxury. Chapter 6, Palaces of Breeze, when kings decided comfort should be majestic. Now that we've spent a night or two in the quiet courtyards of ordinary Persians, let's glide towards something grander, the palaces. Because, of course, no civilization ever invented something brilliant without a king stepping in and saying, I'll take one of those, but bigger. And in Persia, they didn't just build bigger, they built beautifully. Palaces weren't simply places to rule from, they were designed to impress, intimidate, and, crucially, to stay livable when the desert decided to act like the inside of an oven. You'd think kings could have ordered 1,000 fans or, I don't know, relocated to a mountain. But no, Persian rulers doubled down on elegance. Let's drift to Pasargadae, the ceremonial capital founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BC. Cyrus, being both an empire builder and a bit of a minimalist by royal standards, didn't go for heavy fortifications or towering citadels. Instead, he wanted open space. Gardens that breathed. His palace complex spread across the plain like a collection of pavilions rather than one giant building, each separated by open courtyards, water channels, and perfectly planned gardens. It was like an early version of modern passive cooling. The layout itself encouraged air to move freely through shaded walkways. And it wasn't accidental. The Achaemenid architects knew exactly what they were doing. Columns were spaced far apart to let the wind circulate. Walls were placed to catch the best drafts. Reflective limestone and bright plasters helped reduce heat absorption. The Persians weren't just building monuments, they were designing airflow in stone. Now, move forward a century or so, and you reach Persepolis, the showpiece of Darius the Great. This place wasn't just a palace, it was a statement written in marble and carved reliefs. We control half the known world, and we also have perfect indoor temperatures. The main halls, especially the Apadana, were engineered to stay relatively cool despite being enormous. Thick stone columns held up high ceilings that created natural convection. Hot air rose and escaped, while cooler air flowed in through shaded doorways. The terraces faced prevailing winds from the north, ensuring a steady breeze. The effect would have been subtle but noticeable, the kind of cooling that doesn't feel mechanical, just right. And then there were the gardens, the famous paradisa, the very root of our word paradise. These weren't just pretty places for afternoon strolls, they were part of the climate system. Laid out in geometric symmetry, they featured running channels of water, often fed by underground Qanats, and were lined with shade trees like plane, cypress, and pomegranate. Water evaporated, cooling the air, and the trees provided filtered light. The breeze moved through leaves, creating that faint rustle that, once you notice it, you never quite forget. For Persians, gardens weren't decorative, they were architectural tools. They manipulated temperature, light, sound, and scent, turning heat into harmony. Imagine stepping from a sun-drenched terrace into the garden's dappled shade, hearing water trickle, feeling that small drop in temperature, smelling roses and wet soil. It wasn't just relief, it was theater, comfort staged by geometry. Of course, royal life added its own flourishes. Indoor pools, marble basins, glazed tiles designed to reflect light and cool the room. Even color choices mattered. Blues and greens dominated decorative schemes, psychologically associated with coolness and calm. You could argue that Persian palaces were the earliest form of sensory design, places built to soothe the mind as much as the body. Fast forward to the Safavid era, and the concept reached full artistic maturity. Shah Abbas I, the man who practically turned Isfahan into a living art gallery, poured the empire's wealth into architectural perfection. His palaces, like the Ali Kapu and Chehel Sotoun, blended old Persian cooling traditions with Islamic aesthetics and a touch of Renaissance drama. Take Chehel Sotoun, for instance, the palace of 40 columns. It sits beside a reflective pool that doubles its image, creating the illusion of endless symmetry. But behind that poetic illusion was physics. The pool wasn't just there for beauty, it cooled the air drifting toward the open pavilion. The building itself had a high, shaded roof, open on 3 sides to encourage cross breezes. Paintings of courtly splendor covered the walls, feasts, hunts, diplomatic receptions, but all of it happened in comfort, beneath ceilings that whispered with air movement and water's echo. Even the acoustic design mattered. Architects positioned water features not just for cooling but for sound masking. The gurgle of fountains softened voices, muffled political conversations, and covered the occasional royal tantrum, which, let's be honest, probably happened often. And if you think this is just a Persian thing, well, it wasn't. The concept of the paradisa spread across the Islamic world and beyond. Mughal India's palaces in Delhi and Agra, Andalusian courtyards in Spain, even the Alhambra in Granada, all carried Persian DNA in their design. Cool air, running water, geometric gardens, reflective tiles, all tracing back to the Iranian plateau, where somebody once decided that you could, in fact, air-condition a desert with elegance. But before we float too far from Persia, it's worth lingering on the philosophy that ran beneath all this, the idea that comfort and divinity were intertwined. The Persian garden wasn't just an earthly invention, it was meant to symbolize paradise itself, a heavenly order, a place of eternal shade and water. To be cool was, quite literally, to be blessed. In royal symbolism, this mattered deeply. The king wasn't merely a ruler, he was a steward of cosmic harmony. If his palace was well-balanced, cool, and orderly, it reflected the stability of his reign. If the air flowed smoothly through his halls, so too did justice and fortune. In other words, good ventilation was good governance. That might sound poetic, but there's truth in it. These architectural systems were metaphors made tangible. You could stand in a palace courtyard, feel the breeze, hear the fountains, and sense, even if only for a moment, that the universe was in perfect equilibrium. Of course, no equilibrium lasts forever. Palaces rise, crumble, and turn to dust. The windcatchers fall silent, the pools dry up. But the ideas, those linger. They whispered across continents, inspiring builders centuries later to rediscover the same truths, that architecture isn't just shelter, it's a negotiation between humans and climate, pride and humility, grandeur and grace. So as we drift out of these royal gardens and back toward the wider empire, we'll follow that whisper to the people who carried it forward. Not kings, not nobles, but the architects, artisans, and engineers whose names rarely survived. The ones who actually built the breeze. Chapter 7. The Builders of Breeze, Masters, Masons, and the Quiet Science of Cool. Let's drift, then, from the marble halls of kings to the hands that built them. Because for every glittering Persian palace, for every silent courtyard, there were hundreds of builders who made the impossible look effortless. Artisans, masons, and engineers who worked with sun-baked clay, not blueprints. And unlike their royal employers, these people didn't make history by having their faces carved into stone. They made it by understanding stone itself. The Persian architectural world was not led by celebrity designers in expensive robes. It was shaped by guilds, networks of craftsmen who passed down knowledge through apprenticeship, loyalty, and endless repetition. They didn't need theory books. Their textbooks were the walls they built, the wells they dug, the wind they caught. A master builder, a mimar, didn't just draw pretty arches. He was part physicist, part artist, part philosopher. He understood how air moved through space, how heat collected, how water evaporated, and how to balance all of that with the demands of daily life. His tools were simple, wooden levels, measuring cords, chisels, buckets, but his understanding of climate and material was profound. To design a badgir or an anbar wasn't about copying a pattern. It required reading the land itself. Before laying a single brick, builders would study the wind, where it came from, how it shifted through seasons, how it sounded against walls. They'd walk the terrain, feel the soil, test the moisture. It was an architecture born of listening. In Yazd, that city of towers and dust, a builder could tell you the ideal height of a windcatcher based on the width of the courtyard it served. Too tall, and the wind would rush in too violently. Too short, and it wouldn't reach the rooms below. The slits at the top of the badgir were cut with precise angles, sometimes fitted with wooden or ceramic slats to direct the air downward. Inside, smooth plastered surfaces minimized resistance. Everything worked toward one goal: silence and flow. Because that was the thing, Persian architecture didn't shout. It breathed. These builders had no word for sustainability. They didn't need one. Their world depended on it. Every material they used came from within walking distance: clay, straw, lime, stone. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be. And through centuries of trial, error, and sheer survival, they learned how to make a building live in harmony with its surroundings. Mud brick, for instance, wasn't just cheap, it was smart. Its thermal inertia allowed buildings to regulate temperature naturally. In regions where wood was scarce, it also made sense structurally. And when a building finally collapsed, its bricks simply returned to the earth. A recycling system older than the concept itself. Then there were the domes, graceful, mathematical, and deeply practical. A dome didn't just look good, it created convection currents that pulled hot air upward and out through small openings, leaving cooler air below. Some domes were even double-layered, with hidden air gaps acting like ancient insulation. The result was a room that stayed remarkably cool, even under a burning sky. The same precision went into underground design. Builders dug Qanats by hand, narrow tunnels stretching for miles beneath the desert, carrying cold groundwater to settlements. It was brutal work, done in darkness, with only oil lamps and instinct. Misjudge the gradient by a few centimeters, and the whole thing failed. But get it right, and you brought life to an entire city. Some Qanats ran for over 50 kilometers, a feat of surveying skill that still baffles modern engineers. And these weren't isolated geniuses working in secret. Persian architecture was collective, generational. The knowledge was layered like the mud they used, 1,000 anonymous hands shaping a shared tradition. The techniques evolved, yes, but slowly, cautiously. When something worked, it stayed. When it didn't, the desert reminded them swiftly. Of course, not everyone appreciated the science behind it. To outsiders, especially later European travelers, Persian houses seemed oddly plain, almost austere. They missed the point entirely. They didn't feel the cool air drifting through the courtyard or notice how the badger shifted direction with the wind. They looked for grandeur in the facade, not realizing it was hidden inside. But Persians didn't build for show, they built for survival. The exteriors were intentionally modest, almost monastic. Inside was where the real wealth lay, in the shade, the silence, the small mercy of a breeze at noon. And though many of these techniques look ancient now, they were far ahead of their time. Some modern architects have tried to recreate badgers using computers and fluid dynamic software, only to find that the old ratios were nearly perfect already. Imagine that 1,000 years before thermodynamics was a field of study, Persian builders were solving its equations with clay and intuition. But there's something deeply human about this craft, too. The builders weren't just solving environmental problems, they were shaping emotional comfort. The coolness of a Persian home wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, sensory. A place of calm after the glare of the desert. You can almost picture them, a line of workers hoisting bricks, a foreman standing under the rising frame of a dome, squinting against the sun. Maybe there's laughter, maybe complaints about wages, maybe someone complaining that the winds shifted again. They weren't romantic heroes, they were professionals, solving problems with their hands. And yet, their legacy outlasted the kings they served. The palaces of Darius fell. The empires came and went. But the badgers still stand, catching the same eternal wind. There's a quiet kind of immortality in that. Even now, walking through Yazd or Kashan, you can sense their presence, not as ghosts, but as logic. You feel it in the proportions of the alleys, the thickness of the walls, the way the air changes when you turn a corner. It's architecture that speaks softly, but constantly. And maybe that's the real genius of Persian cooling. It doesn't just tame the desert, it listens to it. Let's float, then, from the builders to their inheritance, the way these techniques spread beyond Persia, across empires and centuries, carried by trade, conquest, and imitation. Because once the world saw that you could make the desert feel like springtime, everyone wanted a piece of that breeze. Chapter 8. When the desert dreamed of water, the Persian garden and the climate of paradise. Let's step now into the shade. You've been walking through hot courtyards, past mud brick walls and whispering windcatchers, and suddenly, the air changes. There's a rustle, a shimmer, a sound like liquid light. You've entered what the Persians called paradisa, the walled garden, the original paradise. Yes, that word. Paradise didn't come from heaven. It came from here, from the ancient Persian idea of an enclosed, cultivated space where nature and geometry met halfway. A slice of order carved into chaos. In the middle of a burning landscape, these gardens were not just decoration. They were acts of defiance. You can imagine the logic behind them. If the world outside is endless dust, then make your own Eden within walls. Control the water, the air, the shade, and you've outsmarted the desert itself. The Persian garden was, in a sense, the sister invention to the badgir and the Qanat. All three were expressions of the same dream: coolness, order, permanence. The builders who designed windcatchers were often the same minds who laid out gardens. Because for Persians, cooling was never just mechanical, it was emotional, aesthetic, even spiritual. Picture it, a rectangular enclosure divided into 4 perfect quadrants by narrow channels of water, the Chaharbagh. The layout was not arbitrary. It symbolized the 4 rivers of paradise described in Zoroastrian cosmology: water, milk, wine, and honey. In reality, only one flowed: water, drawn silently from a Qanat below. But the symbolism mattered. You weren't just irrigating plants, you were recreating the cosmic order. Each stream mirrored another, creating symmetry that soothed the eye and the mind. Fountains sat at their intersections, murmuring softly, cooling the air by evaporation. Around them grew cypress trees, the emblem of eternity, alongside fruit trees and flowers chosen as much for scent as for sight: roses, jasmines, pomegranates. The garden was a sensory engine, engineered to please and to pacify. And that's the thing. Persian cooling was not about machinery. It was about mood. The garden was a technology of feeling. The sound of trickling water was deliberate, a low, rhythmic pulse that calmed the listener. The breeze, guided by walls and shaded pathways, slowed just enough to brush the skin. Light filtered through leaves, scattering into a pattern that danced across marble tiles. Everything was designed to create serenity, to make heat something distant and irrelevant. Even the ground beneath your feet was part of the cooling system. Brick and stone paths absorbed heat during the day but radiated it upwards slowly, keeping the ambient air temperature lower. The dense greenery increased humidity, softening the harshness of the desert wind. It was passive climate control disguised as beauty. And for the elite, kings, poets, mystics, the garden was a laboratory of reflection. It was where emperors planned wars and where philosophers meditated on existence. In Persian poetry, the garden became a metaphor for the self, the human mind cultivated against the wildness of the world. The gardener was the soul's engineer, pruning excess, channeling energy, maintaining balance. It wasn't only Persian kings who saw the power of this design. When Alexander marched through Persia, he took more than gold. He took inspiration. Later, Islamic rulers inherited the same ideals. Under the Abbasids, the Persian garden became the Islamic garden, spreading from Baghdad to Andalusia, from Cairo to Delhi. The very layout of the Alhambra, with its pools and shaded courtyards, whispers Persian. The Mughal emperors of India, obsessed with symmetry and reflection, built their own reinterpretations, most famously the gardens of the Taj Mahal. But even as these gardens became symbols of luxury and empire, their essence remained the same. They were machines of climate and emotion. And their genius lay in restraint. Unlike the ornamental excess of later European gardens, all manicured hedges and grand fountains, Persian gardens worked with the land, not against it. They didn't impose order, they invited it gently. Water didn't gush, it flowed. Walls didn't trap, they embraced. It's worth pausing to imagine how they were experienced in their prime. The traveler, dusty from the road, would approach a low wall of sun-baked brick. Beyond it, nothing but silence. Then, stepping through a small wooden gate, a shock of green, a rush of scent, and the sound of water. His body would relax instantly, like an animal finding shade. That's not luxury. That's survival dressed as grace. Even the architecture around the gardens, pavilions, tea houses, terraces, was designed to extend this feeling. Open verandas faced the water channels. Latticed screens filtered light and insects. The ceilings of garden pavilions were often painted with floral motifs that mirrored the plants outside, creating an infinite illusion of growth. The garden wasn't separate from the building, it was the building. Or rather, it was the continuation of the same philosophy: control the air, manage the light, and the soul will follow. Over centuries, Persian poets couldn't resist turning these spaces into metaphors. Sa'di, Hafez, and Rumi all wrote of gardens as mirrors of divine beauty, the place where lovers met, where wisdom blossomed, where mortality felt briefly suspended. The scent of roses, the sound of water, the brush of wind, all became symbols of eternity. But underneath the mysticism was always the physics. The evaporating water, the shaded geometry, the engineered microclimate. For the Persians, beauty and practicality were never enemies. They were halves of the same truth, that comfort could be divine and divinity could be engineered. Modern architects talk about biophilic design and passive cooling systems. The Persians were doing both before concrete existed. They built places that breathed, that healed, that taught stillness in motion. And though many gardens have vanished, swallowed by cities or deserts, the blueprint remains. The courtyards of Shiraz, the terraces of Isfahan, the hidden oases of Yazd, each one still murmurs the same secret, that to conquer heat, you don't fight it. You harmonize with it. The desert dreamed of water, and the Persians gave it form. So as we leave the shade of paradise and step back into the glare of empire, we'll follow that dream outward, because in the centuries to come, these ideas would travel far beyond Persia's borders, reshaping how the world imagined coolness, comfort, and even heaven itself. And all of it began here, in the hush of water beneath a fig tree. Chapter 9: The Desert's Legacy, Persia's Climate Wisdom Across Empires. From the quiet shade of Persian gardens, let's drift outward, beyond the walls of courtyards and palaces, into the wider world, the world that the Persians unknowingly taught how to live with heat. Because the innovations we've been following didn't stay in Persia. They traveled, carried on the backs of merchants, soldiers, and scholars, leaving traces in distant lands that centuries later would still be admired, and sometimes misunderstood. Take, for instance, the Islamic empires that rose from Persia's ashes. The Abbasids in Baghdad inherited much of Persian knowledge: Qanats, Windcatchers, and garden layouts. But they also added their own touches: intricate makarnas ceilings that reflected light and dispersed heat, stucco screens to shade windows while allowing air to pass, and multi-story houses arranged around central courtyards. The principles remained the same: cool air, shaded spaces, water, and geometry. In North Africa, the Persian influence took root in the Maghreb. Cities like Marrakesh and Fez adopted courtyard homes, fountains, and passive ventilation strategies directly inspired by Persian designs. You might walk past a riad today and not realize that the very feeling of relief when you step inside, the drop in temperature, the quiet trickle of water, the filtered light, is the echo of 2,500-year-old Persian engineering. In Spain, Al-Andalus absorbed similar ideas. The Alhambra in Granada is perhaps the most famous example: cool, airy courtyards, fountains at the center, reflecting pools doubling columns in mirror-like symmetry. Andalusian architects may not have called it Persian, but every courtyard, every channel, every shade-conscious window whispers the same language: understand nature, work with it, and comfort will follow. Even further east, the Mughal emperors in India became enthusiastic disciples of Persian garden design. The Taj Mahal, Fatehpur Sikri, and the Red Fort all carried Persian principles: charbagh layouts, fountains, shaded corridors, and cross-ventilated halls. The gardens became both political statements and climate systems. After all, an emperor who could keep his court comfortable while the Indian summer blazed outside was an emperor demonstrating divine favor and administrative skill. And through it all, the underlying philosophy remained remarkably consistent. Comfort is not indulgence, it is mastery. Not mastery over nature in the destructive sense, but a mastery born of listening, observing, and guiding. Water and air were not just resources, they were instruments, part of a subtle orchestration that affected mood, perception, and even social hierarchy. The Persian approach to climate was also deeply social. You can trace a kind of democratic thread through it. Not equality, of course, but intention. Courtyards weren't only for kings. Every city dweller could design their home to catch the wind, shade themselves, and benefit from evaporative cooling. Badgers weren't exclusively royal. Neighborhoods in Yazd and Kashan still have homes where the design hierarchy: small windcatchers for modest homes, taller towers for wealthier households, subtly reflected status while still improving daily life. It's worth noting that all of this knowledge came without a single electrical appliance. No fans, no refrigerants, no pumps. The systems were passive. They relied entirely on physics, local materials, and patient observation. Yet they could make a desert climate tolerable, even pleasant. That's an elegance modern engineers sometimes struggle to replicate. Even European travelers noticed this, centuries later. They described Persian cities with a mixture of admiration and confusion. They saw the high walls, the still air, the whisper of water, and sometimes assumed the coolness was magical rather than engineered. Few recognized the genius that Persia had built an entire climate-conscious civilization before the word thermodynamics existed. And let's pause for a moment to appreciate the irony. While Europeans were often building stone castles that trapped heat, smoke, and stench, the Persians were quietly perfecting passive cooling. It wasn't showy. It wasn't about brute force. It was subtle, intelligent, and, in its own way, far more sustainable. The legacy didn't end with gardens or palaces. Caravanserais, mosques, bazaars, and private homes all carried forward the same principles: thick walls, shaded passages, central courtyards, water channels, and ventilation towers. It was a civilization-wide orchestration of comfort, a poetry of coolness that extended from kings to commoners. Even today, the old city districts of Yazd or Isfahan demonstrate the same principles. Step through a narrow alley, and the sun suddenly feels distant. A courtyard opens, a fountain murmurs, and the breeze drifts down a windcatcher. You feel the centuries of careful observation embedded in every brick. It's a living museum of environmental intelligence. And yet, the story also carries a warning. The systems are fragile. When maintenance lapsed, Qanats dried, windcatchers crumbled, or gardens were neglected, the desert reasserted itself with brutal clarity. Persian cooling wasn't invincible, it was attentive. It required care, observation, and respect for the forces it worked with. Perhaps that's part of its enduring appeal. It's a reminder that comfort, beauty, and order are never free. They are earned through understanding, patience, and collaboration between humans, materials, and the environment. As we drift toward the end of this chapter, it's remarkable to see how Persia's ideas spread, adapted, and endured. From the desert plains to royal courts, from city houses to monumental gardens, the principles remained. Harness wind, water, shade, and geometry to create harmony. The methods evolved, but the philosophy never did. And so, the legacy of ancient Persian air conditioning is not just in the cooling towers, the flowing water, or the shaded courtyards. It's in the very concept of designing life with patience, intelligence, and elegance. A civilization that understood that sometimes the greatest power is quiet, invisible, and utterly human. The desert had taught its people well: survive with grace, design with foresight, and respect the wind. And the world listened, centuries later, in gardens, palaces, and homes across continents. Chapter 10: Royal Comforts and Quiet Obsessions: How Persia's Elites Lived in the Breeze. Now that we've traced the science, the gardens, and the architecture, let's drift gently into the human side of Persian cooling, the people who actually lived in these perfectly engineered spaces. Because while the technology is impressive, the way it shaped the daily lives, habits, and even quirks of Persia's elite is quietly fascinating. Imagine a Shah in his palace in Isfahan during the height of the Safavid Empire. Let's say it's summer, which, in Persia, is less a season than a trial by fire. The king's quarters are shielded from direct sunlight, doors open into shaded courtyards, and the breeze flows down from a towering badgir. A pool glimmers in the center, reflecting the painted ceiling and the columns rising like quiet sentinels. The water trickles slowly, rhythmically, not loud enough to disturb, just present. The room is comfortably cool, a rare luxury when the streets beyond are dust and fire. For the Shah, this was more than comfort, it was power. To live in a space where climate obeyed design, where the environment could be controlled so subtly, reinforced his sense of order over the empire. It wasn't just about relief from heat. It was about prestige, taste, and ritualized life. Every movement in the palace was coordinated with the architecture. The day began in the courtyard under filtered sunlight, continued with meetings in open halls cooled by water channels, and ended with evening strolls in the gardens, where fountains and fragrant trees dictated a natural rhythm. But of course, humans are complicated, and rulers are no exception. Some Shahs became obsessively attached to their microclimates. One might insist that the Windcatcher's slats be adjusted daily to ensure the air always arrived at exactly the right temperature. Another would test the temperature of water pools with his own hands before allowing guests near them, because comfort, like court politics, could not be left to chance. And then there was leisure. The Persian elite could spend hours simply moving through cooled spaces, choosing the most comfortable corner for reading, writing, or poetry recitation. It may sound banal, but there's a subtle opulence in this. They were not just avoiding heat, they were cultivating calm. A carefully timed nap, a quiet sip of sherbet, the faint rustle of leaves, all part of a deliberate, almost meditative experience. But let's float toward the domestic side of life. Queens, concubines, and children also enjoyed these innovations, albeit in different ways. Women of the harem would often retreat to shaded terraces or smaller, private courtyards, where windcatchers provided gentle airflow and fountains hummed quietly. It was a world designed to be comfortable, but also secluded. Walls not only kept heat out but eyes as well. Privacy and climate were intertwined. Children, naturally, loved the spaces for exploration. They would scamper around pools, climb low walls, and watch the light change across the courtyard tiles. In these moments, the architecture was not just functional, it became a playground. Every shadow was a hideaway, every breeze a small delight. And yet, these children were growing up in a world where environmental mastery was expected. Comfort was a given, but understanding it, noticing the wind, feeling the shift in air, respecting the water channels, was part of the education. Even servants, despite their lower status, relied on these systems. Kitchens, often tucked away in shaded areas or partially underground, benefited from windcatchers or evaporative cooling. Food storage relied on subterranean rooms or up-on bars to maintain freshness. The cool air shaped every aspect of daily life, from cooking to cleaning to ceremonial preparation. In a way, the entire household existed within a carefully orchestrated climate. Everyone played a part, knowingly or not, in preserving the microcosm of comfort. And yes, there was drama, even here. Royal families could be petty, jealous, or obsessive. One queen might insist that a particular courtyard be hers alone because its breeze felt softer. A prince might argue over the placement of a small pool, claiming it affected the room's temperature. These sound like trivial disputes, and perhaps they were, but they also demonstrate how deeply intertwined comfort, status, and personality could be in Persian palaces. Every breeze, every shade, every drop of water carried meaning. The rituals themselves reflected this. Afternoon tea in the garden, a ceremonial stroll through the charbag, even the way cushions were arranged for guests. All of it was guided by an unspoken understanding of air, light, and heat. In effect, the Shah's daily life was a choreography dictated by climate. And the architecture, trained like a patient servant, responded silently to every whim, ensuring that power and pleasure were inseparable. It's tempting to view this as indulgence, and perhaps it was. But there's also a subtler perspective. In a desert environment where the natural world is harsh and relentless, the ability to create controlled comfort is survival elevated to art. Persian elites did not merely shelter themselves. They transformed the desert into a livable stage for human life, intellect, and emotion. And as with every aspect of Persian innovation, there was a legacy. Later dynasties in India, the Ottoman Empire, and even Andalusia observed, borrowed, and adapted these methods. They recognized that comfort could be engineered elegantly, that architecture could shape human behavior as surely as climate shaped stone. By now, it's clear that Persian air conditioning, from badgers to gardens to cooled halls, was more than an invention. It was a philosophy, a lifestyle, and a stage upon which the daily dramas of kings, queens, and children unfolded. Every sigh of wind, every shimmer of water, every shadowed corner contributed to a carefully balanced world. And so, drifting through the cool halls and shaded gardens of Persia, we begin to understand why these innovations mattered. They weren't just about survival. They were about shaping experience, dictating rhythm, and elevating life itself, turning the harsh desert into a place of subtle luxury, quiet reflection, and gentle human mastery. Even in the desert's relentless sun, Persia had built a world where air, water, and shade were instruments of grace. And the people who lived there, rulers, families, and builders alike, learned to harmonize with it, crafting a life that was cooler, calmer, and remarkably, almost serene. Chapter 11. From Persia to the World, the Spread of Cooling Genius. Now that we've spent time with Persian kings, families, and their carefully engineered homes, let's drift outward again, this time following the quiet journey of Persian cooling techniques across continents and centuries. Because the innovations we've been exploring didn't stay confined to the Iranian plateau. They traveled along trade routes, through conquest, and by imitation, leaving traces in architecture from the deserts of Central Asia to the courts of India. The first major adoption occurred in the Islamic empires that grew directly from Persian influence. The Abbasids in Baghdad were particularly receptive. They inherited Persian gardens, windcatchers, Qanats, and courtyard layouts, then adapted them to urban life in Mesopotamia. Houses in Baghdad, Kufa, and Samarra were often multi-story, built around central courtyards with small pools and water channels to cool both rooms and air. The design was so effective that even in the height of summer, when temperatures could soar, interiors remained tolerable without a single mechanical fan. In addition to homes, public structures adopted Persian methods. Mosques, madrasas, caravanserais, and markets incorporated thick walls, water features, and clever ventilation. The architectural philosophy was consistent. Shade, water, and air movement were not aesthetic luxuries. They were survival tools. Even minarets sometimes doubled as ventilation towers. Traveling westward, the Persian influence reached North Africa. Cities like Marrakesh, Fez, and Cairo absorbed courtyard-centered designs and passive cooling techniques. The riads of Morocco, with their enclosed gardens, water channels, and wind circulation strategies, are essentially Persian in spirit, though the adaptation reflected local climate, materials, and culture. Europeans visiting these cities often marveled at the cool interiors, unaware of the millennia of observation, physics, and intuition behind them. Meanwhile, in Spain, Al-Andalus was the next stop. The Alhambra in Granada is perhaps the most famous example. Its courtyards, fountains, reflecting pools, and shaded arcades demonstrate the same principles of Persian design. Water evaporates to cool the air, high walls create shade, and careful geometry directs airflow naturally through living spaces. Every breeze felt intentional, every reflection in water deliberate. The European visitors and later historians often assumed it was decorative ingenuity alone, but behind every tile, column, and fountain lay centuries of climatic wisdom. Persian techniques traveled east as well. The Mughal Empire in India borrowed heavily, especially under emperors like Babur and Shah Jahan. The Taj Mahal, Fate per Sikri, and the Red Fort display perfectly symmetrical gardens, running water, shaded corridors, and cross-ventilated halls, all heritage of Persian cooling. Even the arrangement of living quarters, audience halls, and private gardens followed principles aimed at comfort: thick walls, elevated terraces, and shaded pools. In India, this wasn't just comfort, it was political theater. To demonstrate mastery over the harsh Indian summer was to demonstrate mastery over the empire itself. Beyond architecture, Persian climate philosophy influenced urban planning. Streets in cities were often narrow and winding, intentionally creating shade. Buildings turned inward, hiding courtyards from the sun. Water channels ran through neighborhoods, subtly cooling the ambient air. Even the smallest home could borrow lessons from grand palaces, creating comfort that was accessible without grandeur. What's remarkable is the consistency of these principles. Across regions, materials, and centuries, the same fundamentals persisted: thick walls to buffer heat, water for cooling and reflection, careful orientation of buildings, windcatchers to direct airflow, and shaded spaces for both privacy and comfort. Persian solutions were simultaneously elegant and pragmatic, not ostentatious, but highly effective. It's also notable that these techniques spread without manuals, blueprints, or formal instruction. Merchants, architects, and builders observed, copied, and adapted designs according to local needs. Knowledge traveled along the Silk Road as silently as the desert wind, yet its impact was profound. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Persian-inspired cooling systems were integral to urban life across the Islamic world and parts of South Asia. Even modern architects, when rediscovering passive cooling and sustainable design, often find themselves converging on the same solutions. The logic is timeless. Shade slows heat, water cools air, airflow distributes comfort. The Persians figured this out empirically, without modern tools, using only observation, intuition, and careful construction. And beyond mere function, these systems shaped human behavior and culture. Courtyards, gardens, and cool halls became social spaces, venues for poetry, music, and quiet diplomacy. Leisure and governance intertwined with climate management, teaching elites and commoners alike that comfort was both physical and psychological. So, as we float across centuries and continents, it becomes clear: Persian air conditioning was not an isolated invention. It was a philosophy of living with environment, a subtle integration of science, aesthetics, and daily life. And though many of the original structures have fallen to time, their ideas persist. Modern passive cooling methods, sustainable architecture, and climate-sensitive urban design all echo principles first mastered by Persian builders over 2 millennia ago. Ultimately, what began as survival in the desert became a global legacy of elegance, practicality, and quiet mastery. From the windcatchers of Yazd to the gardens of the Taj Mahal, from the courtyards of Morocco to the shaded streets of Baghdad, the Persians taught the world a simple truth: comfort doesn't have to scream, it can whisper. And when it does, it lasts far longer than the builders who first shaped it. Chapter 12. Life in the Breeze, Rituals, Poetry, and the Quiet Rhythm of Cool. Now that we've traced Persian cooling from the desert to the palaces and beyond, let's drift inward again, into the subtle ways these innovations shaped daily life. Because for the Persian elite, comfort was not merely mechanical, it was cultural, social, and deeply psychological. The architecture didn't just protect against heat, it orchestrated the rhythm of living, the cadence of conversation, and even the flow of thought. Consider the morning in a well-appointed courtyard. The sun has risen, but the rooms behind thick walls remain pleasantly temperate. Light filters softly through latticed windows, dancing across plastered surfaces. The windcatcher draws in the earliest, coolest air of the day. And the family, Shah, queen, children, perhaps visiting scholars, moves gently through this microclimate. The day begins not with urgency, but with awareness. A sip of tea, a quiet word, a poem read aloud while the fountains whisper. Tea, or rather the Persian equivalent, chai, was not incidental. It was a ritual intimately tied to comfort and climate. Served in shaded alcoves or beneath trellises in gardens, Tea drinking combined hydration, relief from heat, and social order. Guests were seated according to hierarchy, cushions arranged for optimal airflow, and even the serving trays were placed where the breeze might carry the scent of herbs and flowers. One imagines the courtiers glancing around, appreciating both the drink and the subtle cooling strategies embedded in their environment, though perhaps they didn't consciously think about air pressure or thermal mass. It just felt right. Music and poetry shared a similar relationship with architecture. In summer palaces, small ensembles would play near fountains, their sound amplified and softened by water and walls. Poets might recite verses in shaded halls or under trellises where dappled sunlight fell on open books. The rhythm of a ghazal, the cadence of a ney flute, the quiet trickle of water, all blended into an ambient, almost meditative soundtrack. The environment was as much a participant as the performers. Even daily chores followed the logic of coolness. Cooking, laundry, and storage were all planned around shade, water, and airflow. Kitchens were often partially underground, protecting both food and cooks from oppressive heat. Storage rooms and cellars maintained humidity levels to preserve perishables. Courtyards doubled as social spaces and practical zones. Children played near water, servants prepared meals nearby, while elders enjoyed the comfort of shade and air movement. And then there were the private rituals of leisure and reflection. Persian elites loved to observe subtle environmental changes, the way sunlight shifted across a pool, how wind direction altered the feel of a room, or how shadows lengthened along a terrace. These observations were quiet, personal, and surprisingly widespread. You might call it early environmental mindfulness, noticing how architecture and nature interacted and adjusting behavior accordingly. In the gardens, too, there was intentional choreography. Walkways guided footsteps to shaded alcoves or benches near fountains. Certain trees were planted to cast shadows at the hottest hours. Water channels ran in deliberate paths to maximize evaporative cooling along common routes. It was engineering disguised as grace. The architecture dictated the day as much as social convention did. Where to meet, where to rest, where to hold conversation, even when to nap. Children, naturally, learned by immersion. They played among pools, explored shaded corridors, and felt the difference between sunlit paths and cool alcoves. Growing up in these spaces instilled an intuitive understanding of environmental balance. They knew, without needing a manual, that a courtyard with water and trees could be cooler than an empty stone terrace, and that a slight change in wind direction could alter comfort. Even the more extravagant habits of royalty were guided by these principles. Afternoon siestas in cooled chambers, quiet readings in shaded alcoves, and evening strolls along illuminated pools were all embedded in environmental design. The Shah's schedule, like the architecture, followed subtle logic: maximize comfort, minimize heat, and harmonize activity with air and water. And yet, human nature added its own flavor. Persian courtiers could be petty about courtyard privileges, obsess over who got the best seat near the fountain, or argue over which veranda caught the optimal breeze. These small dramas, however trivial, reveal how deeply comfort, social hierarchy, and environment were intertwined. The air, water, and shade were not merely physical phenomena. They were instruments of status and perception. Even spiritual practices were subtly influenced. Meditation, reading sacred texts, and private reflection often took place in spaces designed to soothe the body and mind simultaneously. The ambient coolness, gentle light, and soft water sounds created conditions conducive to calm thought, moral contemplation, and emotional regulation. In a sense, architecture itself became a guide to ethical and reflective life. What emerges, drifting through these courtyards and gardens, is a picture of life calibrated by comfort. Persian air conditioning was not merely technical, it was social, cultural, and deeply human. It shaped the rhythm of daily existence, from governance to leisure, from education to spiritual practice. The same wind that cooled a Shah's hall might guide a child's game, soothe a queen's reading, or set the pace for poetic recitation. Even in ordinary homes, these principles extended beyond elite spaces. Neighborhoods adopted courtyards, water channels, and shade trees on a smaller scale. The architecture provided a shared rhythm of relief from the sun, creating a communal sense of comfort and order. The design was simultaneously democratic and hierarchical, accessible in principle, yet subtly reflecting wealth, status, and taste. Ultimately, Persian cooling was more than a technology or architectural innovation. It was a philosophy of life, a gentle orchestration of air, water, light, and human behavior. It taught patience, attentiveness, and harmony. And it left a legacy that shaped not only buildings but also culture, etiquette, and the very rhythm of daily existence. So as we float through the gardens, courtyards, and halls of ancient Persia, it becomes clear, to live in the breeze was to live in a carefully composed world, where every gust of wind, every ripple of water, and every shifting shadow was part of a larger, quiet symphony, one that blended survival, elegance, and human experience into an enduring legacy of calm. Chapter 13: The Waning Breeze, Decline, Neglect, and Surviving Legacy. As centuries passed, the elegance of Persian cooling began to face new challenges. Empires rose and fell, cities expanded, and the once carefully orchestrated courtyards, gardens, and windcatchers gradually succumbed to neglect, changing priorities, or simple urban growth. It's a quiet story, not one of cataclysm or conquest, but of slow erosion, of human attention drifting elsewhere while the desert remained ever patient, ever demanding. By the late Safavid period, many grand palaces were still maintained, but smaller towns and villages began to see the erosion of these systems. Windcatchers clogged, Qanats required repair, and gardens shrank under economic pressure. The daily rituals that had harmonized life with architecture, afternoon strolls, poetry readings in shaded alcoves, leisurely meals near fountains, became increasingly rare. And when maintenance lapsed, the desert reclaimed its power. Walls baked under the sun, pools dried, and airflows faltered. Even the grand urban planning that once guided entire cities began to fray. Streets widened, alleys straightened, and new buildings ignored centuries of climatic wisdom. Modern materials, brick, cement, and plaster, replaced traditional mud brick and lime, sometimes with the effect of trapping heat rather than mitigating it. While the underlying principles of shade, water, and airflow remained sound, the subtle craft that made them so effective often disappeared along with skilled artisans. Yet the ingenuity of the old systems left marks that persisted. In Yazd, for example, dozens of windcatchers still punctuate the skyline, their silhouettes reminders of a time when comfort was engineered with patience and care. In Isfahan, some gardens remain intact, their pools still reflecting terraces and trees. Even partially functioning Qanats continue to feed water into urban spaces, sustaining life and reminding us of the precise knowledge of generations long gone. There were, of course, adaptations. As cities modernized, Persian cooling techniques were sometimes integrated with new technologies. The same courtyards that once used evaporative cooling might now incorporate fans or pumps, blending ancient and modern strategies. But in many cases, the true elegance, the poetry of airflow, the quiet orchestration of shade, water, and wind could no longer be fully realized. The systems survived, but only as echoes of their former selves. Interestingly, the decline also highlighted just how genius the original designs were. Centuries of trial and error, careful observation, and empirical science were embedded in every courtyard and pavilion. When neglected, the problems became obvious. Rooms overheated, water stagnated, and comfort vanished. The genius of Persian passive cooling was not theoretical. It was tested daily, seasonally, and over generations. The decline only made that brilliance more apparent to those who later studied it. In some regions, Persian techniques influenced later Islamic architecture in subtle ways. Ottoman Turkey, Mughal India, and parts of North Africa continued to use courtyard layouts, water features, and ventilation strategies. Yet, by the 18th and 19th centuries, new materials, urban density, and colonial influence often diminished the reliance on purely passive systems. The knowledge was carried forward, but the perfection of balance between desert and design, human need and environmental constraint was harder to maintain. And yet, even in decline, these systems left enduring lessons. Modern architects studying sustainable design, passive cooling, and climate-adapted structures often find inspiration in the very principles the Persians had mastered millennia ago. Thick walls, high ceilings, shaded courtyards, water channels, and windcatchers all resurface in contemporary eco-architecture. The methods are adapted, technologically enhanced, but the underlying philosophy is remarkably resilient. Understand your environment, harmonize with it, and comfort will follow. There is a certain melancholy in this decline, a reminder that human ingenuity, no matter how elegant, requires care and attention to endure. The desert has always been patient, but it does not forgive neglect. Yet there is also hope, for in the surviving windcatchers, restored gardens, and functioning Qanats, the wisdom of the ancients continues to breathe. One can still step into a courtyard in Yazd or Isfahan and feel that same quiet coolness, that same orchestrated harmony of air, water, and shade. Even tourists or modern inhabitants, perhaps unaware of the centuries of experimentation behind it, experience the effect instinctively. They pause, they breathe easier, they sense the calm that was once carefully cultivated by Persian architects and artisans. In that sense, the legacy survives not merely as a technical achievement, but as an ongoing human experience, a dialogue between environment, design, and life itself. So, as we drift away from these palaces, gardens, and urban courtyards, it's worth reflecting on what makes Persian cooling remarkable. It was never just a tool to fight heat. It was a philosophy, a way of life, and a subtle form of art. From royal courts to ordinary homes, from the desert plains to distant empires, it shaped daily existence with patience, subtlety, and care. And even in decline, it whispers across centuries that comfort can be quiet, elegance can be functional, and the most enduring human creations are those that work with nature rather than against it. Chapter 14. Beneath the surface, anbars, underground cooling, and the hidden life of water. Let's descend now, gently, into the cool, shadowed world beneath Persian cities, where the ingenuity of ancient engineers becomes even more tangible. Above ground, windcatchers, courtyards, and gardens orchestrated comfort in broad, visible ways. Below ground, however, another layer of sophistication quietly shaped daily life. The anbars, underground water reservoirs that were as functional as they were elegant. These subterranean marvels were more than storage tanks. They were climate control systems, social hubs, and engineering triumphs all in one. Typically constructed from brick and coated with thick layers of mortar, anbars were often domed to provide structural stability and limit evaporation. Their entrances were small, shaded staircases that funneled cool air downward. The deeper you descended, the cooler it became. In the summer, water could be several degrees below ambient temperature, a precious resource in the scorching heat. Water from distant Qanats would flow into these reservoirs, often filtered through sand and gravel. Gravity did the work, no pumps were required. The result was a constant supply of fresh, cool water, not only for drinking, cooking, and bathing, but also for cooling homes and gardens. Evaporation from anbars subtly lowered air temperature in connected courtyards, creating an underground to overground climate system that was quietly, brilliantly effective. Some anbars were enormous, designed to supply entire neighborhoods. They were often accompanied by small domed chambers for guardians or caretakers, ensuring the water remained clean and safe. In cities like Yazd and Qazvin, these structures were so large and well-built that many survive today, still holding water as they did centuries ago. They are silent reminders of a time when engineering, climate, and daily life were inseparable. Beyond practicality, anbars had a social dimension. Access to water, especially in urban areas, was both communal and ceremonial. Citizens might visit the reservoir to collect water, exchange news, or pause in the cool shade of its entrance. In some cases, the architecture reflected status. More elaborate domes, decorative brickwork, and ornate ventilation shafts marked affluent districts. Yet even ordinary neighborhoods benefited from the cooling effects of these hidden systems. The design of anbars also reflected an intuitive understanding of thermodynamics. Thick walls absorbed and retained coolness, while underground placement shielded water from direct sunlight. Air movement through connected shafts and windcatchers ensured circulation, preventing stagnation and maintaining freshness. Ingenious valves and overflow channels allowed surplus water to feed gardens, fountains, or even streets, integrating cooling with urban infrastructure. Of course, maintaining these systems required skill and vigilance. Sediment had to be cleared, brickwork repaired, and water carefully managed to prevent contamination. But when properly cared for, anbars could last centuries. Some reservoirs built in the 15th and 16th centuries remain functional today, an astonishing testament to Persian engineering. These underground systems complemented above-ground cooling in remarkable ways. A courtyard might receive wind channeled from a badgir, while water from an anbar fed pools and channels, creating microclimates that were both comfortable and sustainable. Homes, gardens, and public spaces became part of a unified network, an early, passive form of urban climate control that relied on careful observation, empirical testing, and incremental refinement over generations. Even the aesthetics of anbars mattered. Domes were often decorated with intricate brick patterns, makarnas, or glazed tiles. The designs weren't just ornamental, they subtly guided airflow, reduced heat absorption, and distributed weight. Entering such a chamber, one felt the cool, calm air almost as a gift, a hidden oasis beneath the city, invisible to the casual passerby. And the cultural resonance extended beyond utility. Water held spiritual significance in Zoroastrian and Islamic traditions alike. Clean, flowing water represented purity, life, and divine blessing. By integrating functional engineering with cultural symbolism, Persian architects elevated mere infrastructure into a medium of aesthetic, ethical, and social value. Collecting water from an anbar wasn't just a chore, it was a participation in a centuries-old dialogue between human society and its environment. Children, too, learned from these spaces. Descending into a cool chamber, they felt the difference between sun and shade, air and water, learning intuitively about environmental balance. Servants, guards, and gardeners became familiar with subtle cues. A shift in water level, a change in air movement, a crack in the brickwork, all signs that demanded attention and care. The anbar was both a living system and a teacher. Even kings and elite families benefited quietly from these underground marvels. While they lounged in shaded halls or strolled through charbagh gardens, they were unknowingly enveloped in a climate controlled by the subterranean genius of their city. The cool water that passed through pools and channels, the airflow guided by windcatchers, and the shade of trees all relied on these hidden systems. Comfort above ground depended on engineering below ground. In this way, Persian architecture and infrastructure were holistic. Air, water, and structure were interconnected, forming a continuous cycle of observation, feedback, and improvement. Above-ground luxury and below-ground utility were not separate. They were two faces of the same philosophy. Survival, comfort, and elegance can coexist. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of anbars is their longevity. While palaces might fall, gardens fade, and courtyards are repurposed, these subterranean reservoirs endure, silently demonstrating principles that remain relevant today. Modern sustainable architecture and passive cooling techniques could learn much from their simplicity, durability, and integration with natural systems. In the end, the story of Persian cooling is not just about the visible windcatchers or glimmering gardens. It is equally a story of what lies beneath, the careful, deliberate orchestration of water and air, hidden from view yet essential to life, comfort, and society. These underground marvels remind us that true innovation often works quietly, unseen, harmonizing human needs with the environment without spectacle or fanfare. The desert may be relentless above, but beneath the streets and houses of ancient Persia, life, cool, measured, and deliberate, flowed in hidden channels. And in those shadows, the genius of a civilization whispers still. Chapter 15, Cool Minds, How Climate Shaped Thought, Behavior, and Royal Etiquette. Now, let's drift inward again, into the subtle realm where Persian cooling influenced not just comfort, but human thought, behavior, and social interaction. Because for the elites of ancient Persia, The spaces they inhabited weren't neutral containers, they were active participants in daily life. The design of air, water, and shade-shaped moods dictated etiquette and even guided the rhythms of governance. Imagine a Shah in his palace. He sits in a shaded hall, a gentle breeze flowing from a tall windcatcher. Pools of water reflect filtered sunlight onto painted ceilings. The ambient temperature is calm, the sound of flowing water steady and low. Here, decisions are made, trivial and profound alike, in a mind subtly influenced by environmental design. Coolness fosters patience, soft light encourages contemplation, and moving through shaded corridors naturally slows pace. The architecture, consciously or not, nurtures clarity. This wasn't coincidental. Persian architects understood, through experience, if not theory, that comfort affects cognition. The elite's daily routines were synchronized with microclimates. Meetings were scheduled in rooms cooled by air channeled from windcatchers, discussions took place near pools or fountains, and guests were guided along shaded walkways. It's subtle, but over time, the environment reinforced etiquette. Speaking calmly, moving deliberately, observing hierarchy, all in tune with the physical rhythm of the palace. Consider leisure. Afternoon siestas were common, encouraged by rooms designed for serenity. Poetry recitation, music, and quiet conversation all thrived in courtyards and halls with optimal airflow and gentle ambient temperatures. The architecture promoted social cohesion by aligning comfort with interaction. A misaligned hall, overheated chamber, or poorly shaded courtyard could disrupt behavior, create discomfort, and subtly undermine hierarchy. In other words, the buildings themselves were instruments of social order. Children, of course, absorbed these lessons intuitively. Playing among shaded alcoves, running along water channels, or exploring cool staircases to underground aban bars, they learned environmental literacy long before science textbooks existed. They internalized rhythm, patience, and awareness of subtle cues. A shift in wind direction, a sudden sunlight patch, or a rising water level. Through play, they practiced balance between comfort and movement, lessons that would later manifest in etiquette, household responsibility, and social awareness. Even the queen and her attendants participated in this environmental choreography. Private courtyards, shaded verandas, and cooled chambers offered retreats where conversation, reflection, and ritual took place. The placement of cushions, the arrangement of carpets, the positioning of visitors near fountains or shaded windows. All these choices were informed by air, light, and water. Comfort dictated status and behavior simultaneously. The psychological effects extended to governance as well. Persian kings often dealt with delicate political matters in carefully designed spaces. Diplomats and courtiers meeting in cooled halls were more likely to converse with decorum, patience, and attentiveness. The architecture didn't guarantee wise decisions, but it created conditions that encouraged calm, thoughtful deliberation. Over time, this subtle influence of climate on human behavior became an unspoken tool of statecraft. Beyond politics, the cultural implications were profound. Gardens and water channels were imbued with spiritual symbolism. Cool, flowing water represented life, purity, and divine favor. Shaded alcoves and soft light created a sense of introspection and moral reflection. By aligning physical comfort with emotional and spiritual experience, Persian architecture encouraged behavior that was socially, morally, and aesthetically coherent. Even mundane routines were guided by environmental design. Meals, correspondence, reading, and rest all occurred in spaces chosen to maximize comfort and facilitate appropriate behavior. People moved along predictable paths, following corridors, stairs, and courtyards that were carefully calibrated for temperature and airflow. This gentle orchestration of movement, sensation, and interaction shaped daily life with remarkable subtlety. And yet, there was room for human eccentricity. Shahs could become obsessive about slight shifts in wind direction or the perceived coolness of water. Courtiers sometimes argued over preferred seating near fountains. Children sneaked into forbidden courtyards, discovering hidden airflow patterns. These small disruptions reveal that even in a carefully designed climate, human unpredictability remained a constant. but the architecture provided a framework that tempered excess, encouraged reflection, and subtly guided behavior. Ultimately, Persian cooling systems exemplified an integrated philosophy. Climate, architecture, and human experience were inseparable. Comfort was not a trivial luxury but a medium through which society, etiquette, and cognition were shaped. Air, water, and shade were as much teachers as they were tools, quietly influencing behavior, mood, and decision-making. In this way, the physical environment became a subtle form of governance. The palace, the garden, and the underground reservoir were not inert backdrops. They were active participants in daily life. They mediated social interactions, guided emotional states, and even influenced intellectual activity. Persian cooling was, in essence, a form of cultural engineering as elegant as it was practical. As we pause in a shaded alcove, listening to the soft murmur of water and the whisper of wind through lattice screens, it's easy to forget the centuries that produced this mastery. But every stone, every pool, every shaft of airflow embodies centuries of observation, iteration, and thoughtful design. In Persia, comfort was a deliberate art, and living within it shaped not just the body, but the mind and soul as well. The lesson is subtle, enduring, and quietly human. When life is orchestrated with care, when air, water, and space are harmonized with behavior and ritual, comfort becomes more than relief from heat. It becomes a medium through which culture, etiquette, reflection, and even governance flow naturally. Chapter 16. Beyond Persia, Global Echoes of Cool Innovation. From the quiet halls and shaded courtyards of Persia, let's drift outward again, tracing the subtle influence of Persian climate mastery across continents and centuries. Because the ingenuity of windcatchers, gardens, and of anbars did not remain confined to Iran. It migrated, adapted, and persisted in the architecture of distant lands, often quietly, without fanfare. The Ottoman Empire was one of the earliest and most direct inheritors of Persian principles. In Istanbul, Edirne, and other Ottoman cities, architects borrowed heavily from Persian courtyard layouts, fountains, and ventilation strategies. The Topkapi Palace, for example, incorporates multiple courtyards, shaded galleries, and water channels. While the Ottomans introduced new stylistic elements, domes, tile patterns, and grand halls, the underlying philosophy of cooling through air and water movement remained distinctly Persian. In North Africa, Persian influence blended with local tradition. The riads of Marrakesh and Fez are essentially courtyards enclosed by tall walls, with central fountains and gardens that channel airflow naturally. The geometry, proportionality, and integration of water reflect Persian precedent, though adapted for regional climate, materials, and cultural norms. Even streets were designed to shade courtyards and regulate airflow at the urban scale. Visitors from Europe often describe these cities as refreshingly temperate, though few realized the centuries of design thinking that made this possible. Traveling east, the Mughal Empire in India offers perhaps the most spectacular example of Persian ideas fully realized abroad. Babur, a Timurid prince with deep Persian roots, imported architects, gardeners, and engineers who understood charbagh layouts, water distribution, and ventilation. The Taj Mahal, Fate per Sikri, and the Red Fort integrate shaded corridors, flowing water, elevated terraces, and windcatchers, translating Persian methods into the Indian context. The courtyards, pools, and gardens weren't merely decorative. They shaped the rhythms of court life, governance, and social interaction, just as they had in Persia centuries earlier. Even smaller-scale domestic architecture absorbed these lessons. Mughal houses often included private courtyards with fountains, shaded galleries, and subterranean water storage. The principles were remarkably consistent. Shade, airflow, and water were harmonized to create comfort, rhythm, and subtle social hierarchy. The sophistication lay in the details. Brick thickness, orientation, wind direction, and water placement all carefully calibrated for maximum effect. Meanwhile, in Spain, Andalusian architects integrated Persian concepts into Islamic urbanism. The Alhambra in Granada exemplifies this blend. Shaded arcades, reflective pools, and carefully directed airflow create microclimates that reduce summer heat. The principles of evaporative cooling, water-fed air circulation, and shade orientation are recognizably Persian, though filtered through the aesthetics and materials of Andalusia. Even European visitors and chroniclers were impressed by the cool interiors, attributing the effect to decoration rather than deliberate environmental mastery. The influence of Persian design extended even into smaller, functional structures. Caravanserais along trade routes often featured central courtyards with water channels and shaded porticos, providing rest and comfort to travelers and their animals. Markets and public baths were designed to maximize airflow and reduce heat stress. Across the Islamic world, from North Africa to Central Asia, these principles were adapted to diverse climates, demonstrating both the universality and flexibility of Persian methods. And yet, there were limits. As societies modernized and urban density increased, the passive techniques faced new challenges. Streets were widened, buildings replaced mud brick with cement, and mechanical systems began to compete with traditional cooling. The subtle orchestration of wind, water, and shade sometimes gave way to brute force solutions: fans, pumps, and later, air conditioning units. Still, the underlying principles persisted in modified form, informing early modern architecture and inspiring later sustainable design movements. The legacy of Persian cooling also lies in cultural continuity. Courtyards, fountains, and shaded gardens became not just functional spaces but venues for social interaction, reflection, and ritual. Leisure, learning, and governance remained intimately tied to climate-conscious design. In many regions, the influence extended beyond buildings. Urban planning, street orientation, and neighborhood layouts were informed by centuries of observation, experimentation, and adaptation. Ultimately, what Persia achieved was not merely comfort in the desert, it was a philosophy of living with environment. Architecture, engineering, and social practice were interwoven into a holistic system where air, water, and shade-guided behavior, shaped thought, and harmonized life. The diffusion of these ideas across empires and continents illustrates their universality and enduring relevance. From Ottoman courtyards to Mughal gardens, from Andalusian palaces to North African riads, the whisper of Persian windcatchers can still be felt. These systems remind us that passive design, careful observation, and patient refinement can create enduring comfort, elegance, and social order. Lessons that modern architects and engineers continue to rediscover quietly centuries later. And so, the story of Persian cooling is both local and global, ancient and modern, practical and philosophical. It's a story of how human ingenuity, environmental intelligence, and subtle art can transcend geography and time, shaping daily life, culture, and civilization in ways that are still perceptible today.